All right, we're going to be continuing in the Life Principles Daily Bible, or I should say, we're continuing the schedule put forward by this Bible, but we usually end up actually reading from one of my study Bibles because this one is the New King James Version, and I tend to like the ESV a bit more. But we finished up Genesis, one of the best endings ever, where it says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, that many people should be kept alive." Love that verse. Love Joseph's outlook there. But it ends up that the Jews have now moved down into Israel, and then we're picking up in what's called Exodus. And then we'll also be going through our Psalm, our Proverb, and the New Testament as well later. So looking at Exodus, I think I'm mostly going to just try to summarize this, and then we'll get more into expository learning as we get more into Psalm, Proverb, and Matthew. But in Exodus, it starts off talking about Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. And then what happens is the Pharaoh, who was good friends with Joseph and good friends with the Jews, he passes away. So then a new Pharaoh takes his place who doesn't know Joseph and really understand what Joseph did for Egypt when he interpreted the Pharaoh's dream correctly. So then they were able to prepare for the 7-year famine. And then through that, they were able to sell food to everybody else and get all the wealth of what seems to be this entire area of the world. People's livestock first, and then their land, and then having them as servants. So Joseph brings a lot of power into Egypt. But this Pharaoh doesn't seem to have as much of an appreciation for that. And the reason we know that is because he's seeing how much the Jewish people are multiplying, and he becomes a bit afraid that they're going to multiply too much and then perhaps join their enemies, and if some kind of fight breaks out. So this Pharaoh says, all right, we're going to make them work as slaves, bitter hard service. And then he even takes it a little bit further, and he pretty much says that you have to kill all the males. I was looking for the verse. I couldn't really find it. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. And then Moses is born from a house of Levi, and I think it's the Levites that are the priestly class. I'm not exactly sure about that. And he was hid for 3 months because the Pharaoh was trying to kill all the males. But then she can't hide him anymore, so his mom puts him in a basket. And the Pharaoh's daughter ends up finding him. She has a midwife take care of him for a little bit, and then he comes back to the Pharaoh's daughter. So he's actually getting raised in the Pharaoh's house. Then he grows up, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and then he kills the Egyptian. And then he buries the Egyptian, thinks he maybe gets away from it, gets away with it. But then the next day, it says that there's 2 Hebrews talking, and the Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. So the fact that they know about it worries Moses, because he's thinking, oh, if they know about it, who else knows about it? And then the Pharaoh hears of it, and he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So then at this well, he draws some water for the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. He draws some water for them, and then he ends up marrying them. She gave birth to a son. They called his name Gershom, for he said, I've been a sojourner in a foreign land. Just kind of skipping through the details right here, but I think there is already something important that we can pull out of this about Moses. Once again, Moses is a big name in the Old Testament. We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And we have Moses as well. Moses might be the biggest name in the Old Testament, at least of the prophets. But right off the bat, one of the first things he does is something that we're told not to do. He murders an Egyptian. So once again, right off the bat, it's pointing to the fact that he doesn't seem to be the chosen one, the perfect one, the Messiah, the anointed one, whatever you want to call it. And it seems like that's a pattern that's happened with a lot of the people who we've come across in the Old Testament, whether it's Abraham. I think he was the one who kept telling people his wife was his sister, and we're like, what are you doing? And then there's Jacob. He steals his brother's blessing. He's playing tricks. Joseph seemed to be a pretty straight shooter. I can't remember a story where Joseph really did something wrong, except maybe not being smart enough to know that if you have a dream about your brothers bowing down to you, you should probably keep it to yourself. Joseph didn't seem to do too much bad stuff, but throughout a lot of the stories, it seems like there's almost a point being made of showing us that these people are flawed, that we're not supposed to look up to them. We're supposed to see what they point us towards in their imperfection, and they point us towards God, and a lot of them point us towards Jesus coming in the future. So right off the bat, Moses kills someone. So that's a pretty rough start. Although I imagine, just like a lot of the other Old Testament stories, he has some bit of a redemptive arc to it. And then it says, God hears Israel's groaning. I'll read this one just because it's the end of Exodus 2, which is the 2 chapters we're reading today. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. It's interesting that it ends with that, and God knew. I was looking for if there was a note on that, but interestingly not. But it is in, how many times am I going to say interesting? It says that Israel groaned, they cry out for help, their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and then God hears, he remembers his covenant, he sees the people of Israel, and he knows. So it's a pretty classic story right here where people are in hardship, they're in suffering, they cry out to God for help. God hears, he remembers, and a lot of times he immediately answers, although we'll see how quickly he answers here. The main thing that stood out to me as I was reading this is I've read other parts of the Old Testament, and it seems like God is always reminding them of, hey, I'm the God who took you out of slavery, who brought you out of Egypt, just as I promised that I would. And he seems to say that when they forget about what God has done for them. And I think at one point in the Old Testament, they even say, we want to go, we wish we were back in Egypt. We wish you hadn't even taken us out of there. At least we had good food there, and they're literally in slavery, but they start to complain a bit. And what stood out to me as I was reading this verse is they were the ones who asked God to help them. They cry out for help. They're groaning. And then God hears this and he says, all right, it's time to bring you out. So, yeah. And I think that's a good one to remember because they were the ones who asked for it. Now let's get into the psalm and the proverb. So the psalm, maybe I'll just read the first part. Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle, who may dwell in your holy hill? He who walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. I like that. Walks uprightly, works righteousness, and speaks the truth in his heart. And that idea of speaking the truth in the heart, I think is a good way to go. A lot of times, I don't know if this is just me, but if there's some conversation you're thinking is going to happen in the future, or something that might be coming up in the future, at least this is what I do. I'll often rehearse what I'm going to say, and I'll try to anticipate all sorts of different questions and how I would answer this one, that one, that one. But I've started to do something a bit differently, which is perhaps a bit riskier, but it also is much more of an adventure, and I think is a better way to go about it, which is just trusting in God, praying to God, trying to get your heart right with God, because that's the most important thing. If you're going into some tough conversation, you want to be as much with God as you possibly can. Then you want to pray to God, ask Him to speak through you, and then just try to tell the truth. Don't try to anticipate everything. You can't possibly anticipate everything. What you can do is just try to tell the truth as well as you possibly can. And just go into the conversation saying, I don't know what's going to come up. I don't know what the outcome of this conversation is, but I'm going to speak as honestly as I can. So, what would be the opposite of that? The opposite of that would be lying, obviously. But I think a more subtle way to lie and a subtle way to not speak the truth and speak from your heart is when we use our language to kind of boost ourselves up a bit and perhaps lead to some outcome that we desire. I think a big part of speaking truth is letting go of the potential outcomes and just saying what you believe to be true. If you have a specific outcome in mind, then you can try to craft the conversation in order to lead to that outcome. And if that's not what God's will is, then you're just trying to craft something that's against God's will. If that outcome is God's will, then you don't need to craft the conversation to get there. It's going to happen. But if it's against God's will and you are crafting the conversation to get there, whether you're talking yourself up or who knows how you could do this, that's not going to stand. And you might think that it works for a little while, but ultimately God's plan is what's going to win out. And when you go off of the path, it often makes things more difficult because that straight path that God had planned for you was the best route for you to take. And usually when we go off of the path, we have to learn some hard lesson that, this wasn't the right way to go. And you sometimes end up just wasting time before you end up where you would have been if you just trusted God the whole time. So speaking from the heart, speaking truthfully, and just letting go of the outcomes, trusting God, and being careful in the way you use your speech. And by that, I mean watching your speech and seeing if you're doing what I explained earlier about how we can use our speech instrumentally to try to get what we think that we want. We should only want what God wants for us. And if God doesn't want something for us, if God doesn't think we're ready for it, then we shouldn't want it. Now to Proverbs 4:25-27. I'll read the whole thing. It's pretty short here. Let your eyes look, I like this one. Let your eyes look straight ahead, and your eyelids look right before you. Ponder the path of your feet, and let all your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or the left. Remove your foot from evil. So I love this one because of kind of what I was talking about earlier, about how it's so tempting to think of something in the future and then try to think of every single scenario and try to plan everything. I did one of those Myers-Briggs personality tests. I think it was 16personalities.com. And I was the INTJ, which is known as the strategist and the planner. And that's kind of the way that I think. If I have some goal, then I start to immediately strategize about how to get there, which in some cases is good. Like, for example, I'm trying to serve people through wildfire forecasting and wildfire education. So it does make sense for me to plan what kind of studio I'm going to build, what kind of lessons I want to teach moving forward, and have a bit of a strategy, a bit of a business model, if you want to call it that, because that's going to increase my ability to serve other people. However, there's a point where you can take this too far. If I try to plan every video I'm going to do for the next 6 months, that would not be smart because I might learn something a week in, and because I've learned more a week from now than I know now, then I have a better ability to plan. So it's also smart to be able to adapt as you learn more, because if you just set course and go straight for 6 months, most likely wherever you were when you set that plan, you're not as you don't have as much information as you do as you start to learn more and more. So you want to be able to adapt, but you also want to be in a position where you want to trust God. It's very tempting for us to take too much control of things to the point where we feel like we get a sense of security from doing that. But one of the best things you can do is put up your hand and say, God, I'll try to figure out what it is that you want me to do. And then that's what I'll do. For example, I was actually kind of going away from weather and wildfire forecasting until God made it very clear numerous times that this is something that I should be focused on. And now that I know, I'm thinking, all right, let's go for it. This seems to be what God wants me to do. I'm in. It's actually a relief that I know what God wants me to do. There's other aspects of my life, though, where it's still quite up in the air. And I feel that temptation to try to grab control, to try to plan what's going to happen, to try to feel like I am in control by planning, even though I have no idea what's going to happen. And what this verse is telling us to do is just trust God, look straight ahead. It says, let your eyes look straight ahead, ponder the path of your feet. So what's right in front of you? A lot of times God won't show us what's going to happen way down the line because it actually takes more trust and it builds up our faith more if he only shows us one step ahead. Because then we just have to go. We say, that's what I should be doing right now. All right. What's next? All right. That looks to be what's next. And it almost forces us to be reliant on him. And it says, and let all your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or the left. Remove your foot from evil. So a lot of times, God's not going to give us the entire plan. But what we can do is just look one step ahead, what God has put right in front of us this moment, and go forward with that. Do the best that we can to speak honestly and to not turn to the right or the left. We just try to stay on that path as well as we can. And to resist the temptation to try to strategize and plan everything. That's not the way to go. All right, now we're getting into Matthew 17. It's the transfiguration. And I'll remind you that in the last verse that we read, where Jesus is talking about taking up your cross and following Jesus, and that he's kind of here not to be a king on a throne with a bunch of servants, but he's actually here to be the suffering servant. And you have to take up your cross and follow him. It's a very different call, I would say, than what a lot of the Jews were expecting of the Messiah. But the last verse that he says is, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So some people point to this and they say, oh, Jesus is a false prophet because here he's saying some of the people around me won't taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And they interpret that as revelation, like God, Jesus coming back. And how they interpret it is Jesus is saying, oh, revelation is going to happen before some of you guys die. That would probably be the way you would read it if you were reading the Bible arrogantly and from a place of trying to prove God wrong and prove yourself smarter than God or something like that. However, if we continue reading, it seems to answer this question 6 days later. It says, and after 6 days, very specific time, so it seems that this is important that he's even mentioning how much later it is. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. So transfigured, the term for it, the original term, I believe is metamorphi or something like that, which is where we get our word metamorphosis. Right off the bat, you probably think of a caterpillar completely dissolving and then reappearing into a butterfly. And that's what this is pointing to with Jesus. He transforms in front of the apostles. It also points back to, well, back to Moses seeing God, but we haven't gotten there at this point in Exodus, so we'll get to that story soon. But where I think it's Moses says he wants to see God's face, and God says, if you see my face, you're going to die. Nobody can look upon my face. However, I'll let you look at my back. And Moses sees, I think, his back or something like that. And when he comes back down the hill, his face is shining so much that the people can't even see it. And he's just reflecting God. So in this case, Jesus isn't a reflection of God. This is actually light coming out from him. And this is also something that reminds me of, I think, when somebody's telling us what heaven's going to be like. They say that there's no sun and no moon because the light emanating from, I believe it's God and Christ, it might just be Christ. The light emanating from him is so bright, it lights everything up. And this is what the apostles are seeing right here. It says, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And Peter's kind of funny. I feel like Peter is just speaking at this point, just to speak, and he doesn't really even know what to say. So he's just sort of, I'll make you guys some tents. And I think he's maybe a little overwhelmed and just sort of babbling at this point. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. So let's officially just put to rest that idea that the Bible doesn't say that Jesus is the Son of God. I had heard some atheists say that, and it's been a couple weeks now that we've been reading through Matthew, and I can't even count how many times it's clearly said that Jesus is the Son of God. Both Jesus saying it, and now literally God saying it. He says, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. Probably a accurate response to God. I think when we get a glimpse of who God is and what he's like, it could just be a glimpse, but that little glimpse is enough to crumble your entire being and just crush you to the ground. Because in that glimpse, you see how just amazing and great God is. And it's something we can't even fathom and be in the presence of without feeling crushed. Probably ties in with the idea of the fear of God, fear of the Lord. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. So it seems that Jesus transfigures, he turns into light, it seems like. And then there's Moses and Elijah standing next to him. And then Peter starts babbling a little bit. And then there's a cloud, and God says, This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. And they're terrified. And then Jesus says, Have no fear. And then at that point, it's just Jesus again. And then once again, this is something that we often see Jesus do, but he says, as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And the disciples asked him, Then why did the scribes say that first Elijah will come? And then they figure out that he was talking about John the Baptist and saying that John the Baptist was Elijah. What's interesting, though, is that Jesus says, Don't tell anybody until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. Seems that part of the reason Jesus does this is because he has an idea for his ministry. He knows what needs to go down. He still wants to preach, teach, and heal and share the gospel with people, talk about the coming kingdom, bring more people to repentance. And it seems that a lot of the Jews at this time are starting to come around to the idea that he might be the chosen one, the Messiah. I don't know why I keep saying the chosen one. That seems like such a Star Wars term. Should just say Messiah, or he might be the Christ. he is the Christ, but they seem to be coming around to that idea. But their idea of the Messiah is the war leader who's going to lead a rebellion against Rome. And that's not what Jesus's idea is. So it seems like whenever big things happen, Jesus has a way of calming them down or pulling himself away or telling people not to tell anybody, because he doesn't want everyone to get whipped into a frenzy and then start attacking the Romans, because that's not the plan. But then he also uses this as an opportunity to remind them that he's going to be raised from the dead. And I imagine at this point, they don't totally know what he's talking about. Jesus uses a lot of metaphorical type language, like the leaven of the Pharisees, and they think he's talking about bread. So at this point, they might think he's speaking in some metaphorical way, but he's literally saying, don't tell anyone until I'm raised from the dead. And then it says Jesus heals a boy with a demon. So this kid had seizures and suffered terribly. And he was originally brought to the disciples, but they couldn't heal him. And then Jesus has an interesting response to this. So the person has come up to him and says, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples and they could not heal him. So it seems that this person's coming to him with a pretty good heart, how you're supposed to come to Jesus. He says, Lord, have mercy on my son. And Jesus answers him, almost reminds me a little bit of the Canaanite woman. He says, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me. It almost seems like Jesus is a little annoyed at this point. And I don't know if he's annoyed at the Father or the Son. I don't think that's the case. I think, if anything, he's annoyed at his disciples for not having enough faith to heal this kid. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. So this is a little different than the Canaanite woman, because Jesus doesn't set up some tests and some hoops for them to jump through before he heals them. It seems that they're already showing their faith. So it seems that that's pointing towards the idea that he's having more problem with the disciples' faith, where he says the faithless generation, faithless and twisted generation, than the boy, because he heals him instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? Oh, I guess we're about to find out. He said to them, I've already read this, so I should know what happens, but there's a lot of reading. Because of your little faith. Oh, yeah. So problem solved. It was because of the disciples' little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Faith, definitely important. Then Jesus once again tells of the resurrection. They were gathering in Galilee. Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. And they were greatly distressed. So he's very specific right here. He uses some cryptic language in the last one, like grain of a mustard seed, say to the mountain, move from here to there. Imagine at that point, the disciples are thinking, like, can we actually move a mountain if our faith is strong enough? Or is this a metaphor or some sort of analogy that he's using? So you can maybe give the disciples a little credit to how hard it might have been to interpret some of the things that Jesus was saying. But it's pretty clear what he says next. He says, Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. Hard to misinterpret that one. But it is a pretty wild thing to say. So, yeah. Maybe the disciples need a little bit more faith that Jesus can calm storms and feed thousands of people. Then, yeah, why wouldn't he be able to conquer sin and death as well? It does seem to point to I think I was reading in one of the study Bibles that this is the end of his Galilean ministry, and now they're going to start to work their way down to Jerusalem for basically the final confrontation here. For that, it does say there's a temple tax. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this one. I didn't do much research into it, so I don't know if there's some deeper meaning here. The collectors of the temple tax ask why Jesus doesn't pay the tax. And he says, "From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And then he says, "From others." Jesus said, "Then the sons are free." He's saying, we don't need to pay the temple tax. We're the sons, we're not the others. However, to not give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. Okay. So, yeah, I don't really know what to pull from that. Jesus is saying, that maybe this is pointing to the idea that Jesus isn't here to go against the law or go against the Old Testament, but he's here to fulfill it. This is a case where he doesn't have to, but he's still doing it just to be able to, I don't want to say check the box, but maybe this is showing that he's not here to completely take away the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment of it. I might be reading into that too much, though. Who knows? I think that is where we will wrap up for today, though. What's the main takeaway for today? I think, sometimes it's in the Old Testament where I feel the most connection. A lot of times it's in the New Testament where I feel the most connection. But I think it was the Psalm and the Proverb today. The idea that we should speak the truth and that we should just follow the plan that God has for us. And by plan, I mean what he's putting right in front of us. He's not going to show us the whole journey because we need to trust him. And maybe that's just a special lesson for me, that because one of my weaknesses is always trying to plan things and get control of things. But that's also what's amazing about the Bible is so many teachers that I went to before for knowledge of how to live seem to have one message. Like they boil it down. They say, this is the secret to life. And mold yourself into this way of thinking, and then you'll be good. But what is amazing about the Bible is there's so much in here. It's so densely packed with knowledge and stories and lessons that it can speak to each person individually. For example, maybe somebody else reads it and that temple tax is the thing that speaks exactly to them. And the Holy Spirit highlights it and they learn something that transforms them. But then for me, it was the Psalm and the Proverb about speak the truth and look down at your feet. Don't turn to the right. Don't turn to the left. Trust God and the plan that he has for you. What I'm trying to say is the Bible is so deep that it's able to speak to each of us individually. And that's what God does. That's what the Holy Spirit does. That's what Jesus does. And it shows how amazing God is, that he created the entire universe, the sun, the stars, the mountains, the seas. I guess sun and stars are the same thing. But then he also has the ability to individually focus on each of us. And when we cry out to him for help, he's there. And he's training us exactly how we should be trained. Sometimes we'll throw little tantrums like children, trying to get things to be our way that we want. And we're sinning left and right. We're like that sheep who's stuck in the ditch. They pull it out and it runs along and then just jumps right back into the ditch. And God is able to take how sinful we are, how stupid we are sometimes, and he's able to mold us more and more into the image of Christ as we keep going. It's amazing what the potter is able to do with the clay, especially when the clay is like a dumb sheep. And I'm talking about myself there. So moving forward, try to trust God and speak honestly and just be humble and remember who God is, what he's done for you. And I think gratitude is important as well.